Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, in my last video, I talked about the beauty of competing for excellence in the terms of the fact that I see the people around me that are competing for excellence in what I am now doing, which is writing a graphic novel and putting it together. And I am immersed in that competition for excellence, that great competition for excellence. And oh, by the way, on my graphic novel, a lot of people were asking me, do you have a pre-order page yet so that I can leave my email so that I can order the book when it comes out? I do now have a pre-order page up, and I will link that in the description. The Indiegogo pre-order page is there. You just leave your email, and if you do leave your email and then order the book, you will receive a free pin-up poster along with the graphic novel. So that's what I want to talk about today, this competition for excellence and where this idea comes up, especially in connection with a hero and a villain, and at the same time discuss what makes a hero and a villain. And I'm going to do that by talking about Aristotle and how he lays it down in the Nicomachean Ethics. Because in the section that I'm going to go over, he's talking about people who are virtuous and people who are vice-ridden. And if we go back to parts of his other works, he talks about a hero being a paragon of virtue, or a villain as being someone who is vice-ridden. And again, the reason why I want to do this partly is because I want to discuss this pursuit of excellence and how it fits into the whole thing. And partly because a lot of people have told me that my discussion of a true hero and a true villain has helped them immensely in creating a hero and a villain for their own stories. So you have that literary element that's going to be there. And on top of that, you also have these ideas that apply to yourself directly as well. And on top of that, I'm going to link in this idea of what a vice-ridden person is with people really throughout history who have been vice-ridden, but quite specifically with the people today who call themselves quote-unquote progressives. And I'm still going to give you those comic images in the background because, again, a lot of people discuss this in terms of creating a hero and a villain for their own works. And you can see the larger outline of what I'm about to describe within a lot of these science fiction and comic stories that you probably grew up on. So very briefly, the section of the ethics which I am dealing with is 1168b28 through 1169b1. But the sections around that as well are helpful. And I'm only going to give you a short excerpt from those sections. Aristotle says that the difference is between living according to reason and according to passion, between desiring what is good and desiring what seems advantageous. But those who busy themselves with good works in an exceptional manner receive the approval and praise of all. And if everyone strives for what is good and aims at doing what is best, the whole community will satisfy its needs, and each member will possess the best of goods, since virtue is the best good. Therefore, it is reasonable for the virtuous man to love himself, because in doing good he will help both himself and others. But it is unfortunate for the bad man, because he injures both himself and his neighbor by following his passions. As a result, what the evil man ought to do is in conflict with what he does. For the reason always chooses good for itself, but the good man obeys his reason. It is true of the virtuous man that he does many actions for the sake of his friends and country, and if necessary dies for them. He will sacrifice money, honors, and all goods men strive for, gaining for himself an honorable good. For he will prefer a short period of intense delight to a long period of quiet existence, an illustrious life of a year to an ordinary life of many years, a single notable good deed to many insignificant ones. Certainly those who die for others seem to obtain this result. Thus they choose a great good for themselves. He may even defer to his friends in performing actions, for it is better to be the cause of a friend's acting than to act himself. In all praiseworthy activity, the good man assigns to himself the larger share of virtue. Now, first off, I'll have to say that this section of Aristotle is very much taking its notes from his teacher, which would be Plato. And you can see these specific things being said in the 5th book of Plato's Laws, which I quote a lot because it is the seminal chapter of the seminal work of Plato. And the virtuous man, the hero that both of these men, Plato and Aristotle, describe, is something that is taken up very quickly by the Christians as well. And that's why we have this idea of a hero that has lived along with our civilization for 3,000 years. certainly for 2,400 years since Plato and Aristotle, but since both of them take a lot of their cues about a hero from the Iliad and the Odyssey, well, we're talking about stories that are 400 years older than them, and again, events that inspired those stories, which are 800 years older than them. But to even understand where this hero comes from, where this virtuous man begins, you must understand the way that Western civilization viewed mankind and his nature for millennia up until the last 100 years or so. And this idea is the idea that man is made up of two principles, and that is his reason and his passions. And that reason is the better part. Reason is the one that is in control. Now, passions are still a good thing, but passions are the servant of reason. And they are only a good thing when they are the servant of reason, because reason directs them and channels them towards what is good. And of these two principles within a human being, the reason is in control and the passions are the servant. And Aristotle goes through many arguments to show this to be true, but I'm just going to go over the short argument that he talks about in these sections. The short argument that he gives here is the fact that when a person allows his reason to be in control, if he wishes to do something, that is to say, if he is at point A and he wishes to proceed to point B and he allows his reason to set out the path from A to B, his reason will take him to that point that he wishes to be at point B. But if a person allows his emotions, allows his passions to control him and to control his reason, when the person wishes to go from point A to point B, he generally finds himself at point F and wonders, how did I get here? I did not want to go in this direction. So again, as I'm always talking about, you have to take reality and apply it to the actions of mankind, and it shows this very easily, that reason is the one that should be in control. That is the stronger principle, because when you wish to do something, it actually gives you the ability to do it. Whereas if your passions are in control, you go in the wrong direction. And this again speaks to virtue itself, because part of the definition of virtue is the ability to allow you to complete your ends, the ends of your life, what you are striving for as a whole. And of course, in order to complete ends as a whole, you need to complete smaller ends within your life as well. And so if you want to go from point A to point B, then you need to actually get there in order for you to complete those smaller bits which allow you to complete the ends of your life itself. So yes, reason is the stronger principle within the human being. So much so that reason is identified as the person itself. Reason, or as sometimes it is translated, the intellect, can be seen as the person himself, and is talked about in this manner, even within modern English. Because if a person is being reasonable, we use those terms. Typically, we don't say that he is being controlled by his reason. We're saying he's being reasonable. He is reasonable, and it is identifying reason with the person itself. But if a person is controlled by their passions, we use that statement. Now, if you're saying a person is being passionate, it means something completely different. It is saying that a person is channeling their passion into something and producing something with it, which means that it is passion that is being controlled and directed by the reason. But if you say someone is being controlled by their passions, which is a phrase we can use in English very easily, well, it is talking about a person who is controlled by something outside of themselves. That is to say that they are not typically in control of themselves. Now, first off, this way of discussing things in English not only denotes the fact that reason is the principle within a mankind and can be identified with man himself, whereas passions not so much, but it points out something else that Aristotle is talking about in this section itself. It's the fact that when a person actually allows his reason to be in control, it is also said that his will itself is in control. Or to put it another way, that the reasonable person is the person who accomplishes his will. Again, he wills to go from point A to point B, and he actually gets there. So what he wills comes to pass. But with the man that is controlled by his passion, he is not in direct control of himself. It is not his will that is in control, but it is something outside of himself that is in control of him. Therefore, his will is thwarted. And this leads to something very specific about the vicious man, about the vice-ridden man, about the villain. And it is the fact that they are being controlled by their passions. That is to say, there is some outside force that is controlling them and making their will come to naught. And it comes from the fact that you have this view of humanity, where you have reason that is the higher principle, that is the stronger principle, that is in control, and you have passions, which, while good, are the servants of reason. So if you have a person whose passions are in control of their reason, This is an unnatural state. And again, we can see this is an unnatural state because of the fact that we go back to our experiment. The reasonable man wishes to go from point A to point B, he gets there. The vice-ridden man, the man who allows his passion to control his reason, when he wishes to go from point A to point B, he generally ends up going in the wrong direction. But the point is that if we assume, like Aristotle does here, that this dynamic of human nature is at play, that the reason is the stronger principle and the passions are the weaker principle, if you have a man who lives in a way where the passions are in control of the reason, this is an unnatural state, so much so that it cannot actually exist in itself, because of course the weaker cannot bind and control the stronger. Unless, of course, the weaker is actually being fed by something else which gives it the power to dominate that which is stronger than itself. And thus we get to the point where the vicious man is not in control of himself. Why? Because in order to live in this fashion where his passions control his reason, his passion must necessarily have something outside of the man which is feeding power to those passions, which allow those passions to become stronger than the reason itself. And again, this is why we say that a person is being controlled by their passions. Because, of course, this outside force is not the will of the person. It is something outside of them that is controlling them. Now, of course, the person has to choose. He has to will whether or not he allows this to control him or not. So he's still in control of this aspect of his life. And truly, he is the person who is the author of his own viciousness. But unlike the reasonable man, who actually is accomplishing his own will, the person who is vice-ridden is, of course, ending up eventually at point F because someone else is in control. And this control comes from the fact that this outside force is feeding power so that the passions can overcome the reason. Now, this brings us to the point of what we have today. If we look at these progressives around us today, what are they always talking about? Well, they're always talking about systematic this and systematic that. It's all systematic oppression. It's all systematic racism, etc., etc. It's always the system's problem. It's always the system's fault. Now, why do they think in those terms? Well, they think in those terms because, of course, these are people who are living lives whereas their reason is being controlled by their passions. And we can see this very easily. If you look at some of the things that just I have covered, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. If you look at that Smithsonian article that talked about whiteness and the systems of oppression of whiteness, what was at the top of their list as part of this systems of oppression? Well, it was reason. And if you look at all these progressive writers of all these progressive comics that I'm always going over, what do they talk about? Well, they talk about the main principle being empathy. What mainly they wish to distill within their audience through their characters is empathy. That empathy should be in control. And of course, empathy deals with the emotions, and it comes from the passions. And again, while it can be a good thing, it's not a good thing when you have those passions eclipse your reason and have control over your reason. But this is exactly what these progressives wish to do. So they are people who live in this fashion, whereas their passions are in control of their reason. And if this dynamic of Aristotle is actually true, which I hold to be true, then you can understand very easily why these people are always going on about this systematic oppression. It's because, of course, they're living their entire lives being controlled by something else. They are living their entire lives where their will is thwarted by an outside force that is feeding power into their passions to allow it to become stronger so that it can dominate the reason. And of course, if you live your entire life under such systems, whereas something else is in control of you from outside, well, you're going to see everything that you encounter as a product of this same kind of system. And again, this system, which is about nothing but power, because of course you have to have power in order to feed those passions, in order to allow those passions to become stronger than the reason. Now again, fundamentally, it is the will of these people that is the problem. It is the will of these people that allows them to be vice-ridden, because they allow this to happen to themselves for no other outcome besides the fact that they wish to indulge themselves within licentiousness. To use some old language, they have a character defect where they allow themselves to be steeped in vice. It reminds me of a scene from an ancient play, which was from Terence, if I remember correctly, where you had a master and a servant. And the master was being licentious. The master wanted a woman who it was unlawful and immoral for him to actually want. I think she was related to him, if I can remember the scene correctly. But he was allowing his passions to carry him into this folly. And Terence is ironically using the servant, and the servant is the voice of reason. Because the master says, "I will nothing else than Philomena." And the servant replies, "How much better would it be to banish that love from your heart, than to speak so as uselessly to inflame your passions still more?" And really, now that I think about it, within that scene itself, you have this exact thing which I'm describing. Because the master in the scene really is the passions, and the servant is the reason, but the servant is the one who is actually serving the passions. But you see, things have been flipped over in this unnatural condition, and that's why this master, who is following nothing but his passions, is seeking something where he says, "I will nothing else than this," but it's going to bring him to a bad end, which it eventually does. And although it is his position that allows him to live in this licentious way, to think that he can get away with this to begin with, because it is that is feeding into his passion to allow them to control his reason, what he does, and what the progressives around us today do, is that they turn a blind eye to the fact that the only way that they have gotten into this position is because they willed from the beginning to accept this lie. And we know it's a lie because it's unnatural. And they too know it's a lie because all of reality around us shouts out the truth of how a person should live and how that correct life of a person interacts with reality correctly. And so, to ignore all of that is to willfully choose the lie and willfully accept the fact that they allow this outside force, this outside condition or person or institution to control their lives because they allow it to feed power into their passions so that they can live in this licentious way, whereas the passions can just ride roughshod over the reason. And very quickly, there's two smaller things that should be brought up at this point. Number one being that they see these systems of control everywhere because they live under nothing but this system of control within their own lives. And for my own part, I would say that these people, these outside forces and institutions that are granting them power to allow them to live in this licentious way, they are doing so because in moving from point A to point F, which is where they eventually go, they are carrying water for these people who lend them power to do this, and therefore feeding these large institutions with power in a reciprocal manner. This is why we talk about such people in terms of useful idiots, because the larger institution that is granting them power situates itself at point F, where these people are eventually going to end up in B, and they say, "Oh, just make sure you take something for us along the journey when you try to go from point A to point B." But again, they always end up at point F and carry that water for the institution and bring the thing along with them that that institution needs in order to survive, in order to dominate, in order to lend them this power that allows them to live in this vicious way. And of course, since these people, these progressive people, cannot see outside of this system wherein they live, they can't understand why they keep going from point A to point F instead of getting to point B where they want to go. And since they can't see outside of this system of control, if things are going wrong for them, they believe it is a systematic problem because it's a problem with the system that feeds them this power. And therefore, they always go back to, it is the system's fault. We have to change the system. The system is not allowing me to get from point A to point B, and therefore they must destroy the system and create something new. But of course, they're just not realizing that it's not the system, it's them themselves living in this vicious way that is creating this. And this leads to my second point. This is why you have conservative people typically looking within themselves when something goes wrong. Because if you're living in a way where your reason is in control of your passions, and reason is a principle that you can identify with you yourself, if something goes wrong, what are you going to look at? Well, you're going to look within yourself and say, well, something's wrong here within me. This is the origin origin of my problem. But these people who are opposed to this kind of living, where they live in this licentious way, where their passions are in control of their reason, well, it is not to look inside themselves when something goes wrong. It is to look outside of themselves and point at the systems around them and say, that's the problem. Outside of me is the problem. It's not within me that's the problem. It's that controlling force that is the problem, that is not allowing my will to exercise itself and become reality, where I can get from point A to point B, where I necessarily want to be. But to get back to the idea of the virtuous man, the heroic man, we see right here the strains of ideas that I'm always talking about, that a hero is a paragon of virtue. This virtue begins with right reason, having your reason in accord with reality, and then it leads to the charioteer of all of the virtues, which is prudence, which is correct decision making. And this is exactly what I've been speaking about. Again, for a person to have right reason, they must understand their own nature and understand that their reason should be in control of their passions. This is in part, to a great part, right reason itself, understanding what your nature is and understanding how that nature plays in with the bigger reality around you and accepting that it is so. And then this allows you to make good decisions. That is to say, again, allows your will to carry you from point A to point B, and you actually get there. And then this, of course, will lead you to the other virtues as well. But there is something here that Aristotle assumes that leads straight back to his teacher, who is Plato. And again, it comes from the 5th book of Plato's Laws, where he says, "Honor consists in following the better, and in doing our utmost to effect the betterment of the worse when it admits of being bettered." This is the assumption of both of these men, that there is a system within reality, whereas you can measure what is good and what is better, and that system comes from the fact that you first must know what is good. You first must know what is true. Once you know that ultimate standard of good and true, then everything else can be related to it in a system and measured of how close it is to that goodness. And so this is what honor is in itself, to choose what is the better when you have a choice, or to take something, whether it be something you possess, or yourself, or the friends around you, and you take them and move them higher on the scale towards what is right and true. This is an honorable action. And it is such an honorable action, it becomes what is paramount right after accepting what is true and making yourself a friend of the truth. That is to say that after the honorable and virtuous act of making yourself a friend of the truth, the thing that is the most honorable, the most virtuous, is to take what is worse and to make it better. And this is especially true for those around you. So much so that if you, as a virtuous man, have the ability to act for the greatest good and take the greatest good as it presents itself in front of you, you would actually be doing something more virtuous in allowing another person to do this virtuous act than for you to take it onto yourself. Why? Well, because of course, if you're that virtuous, this opportunity should present itself to you again, and you can take it for yourself at that point. But I would say more importantly, because we're human beings. We're frail. We make mistakes. And the point is that if you have someone, a friend, that is with you, that you can advance in honor, that you can bring closer to what is right and true, you can bring him up to where you are in this order of honor, then you have someone who can compete with you for the greatest of honors, which, as Aristotle says here, is virtue. That is to say, you can have someone who can do this with you, and therefore you have friendship next to you at every point, which can make up for all of your faults, which can make up for every time your foot slips, because of course you have another person just like you next to you, competing for excellence, competing for honor, competing for the virtue that makes you a hero. And of course, you do not begrudge this other person or these other people around you in doing so. Far from it. What you wish to do is to have them excel in excellence. Because again, it is more virtuous for you to prompt them to take what is the most virtuous when it lies before the two of you. And this is why, as Aristotle says in those quotes that I just gave, this is why he says that the virtuous man will give up much for his friends, and will even die for them, and so for his country. Because in giving the greatest honor before him to another, he is actually taking the greatest honor onto himself. And just briefly, These kinds of ideas are not foreign in any way to the ideas of Christianity, because the very ideas expressed within the Christian scripture itself, where you're supposed to love God with all that you have and then love your neighbor as yourself, this is expressing the exact same thing. First, you make yourself a friend of truth, and then once you have done that, then you treat others as if they were yourself. That is to say, you will their good above your good, and as such, bring about a greater good for yourself. And then you hold each other up through this competition for excellence, this competition for virtue. And in living in such a way, this is the embodiment of the self-sacrificial hero. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.